Hello. So today we're here with Izabella Szakdowska, who is a corporate lawyer and partner at Tamimi Law Firm. If you would want to give like a quick introduction.
Hello everyone. I'm a specialist in corporate law. I've been practicing in the UAE for 17 years and before them for 3 years in European countries. I advise family offices, corporate clients on a variety of corporate matters, on foreign direct investment, economic substance issues, growth in the UAE and across the region, but also transactional matters, M&A included. And I've done a bit of work in the equity capital markets.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about something that you mentioned about economic substance. So obviously these are like the tests that are conducted to see if there are like shell companies, so companies that have no real business value and they're just there to, for tax benefits. So I wanted to ask you, when you conduct these economic substance tests, what do you look for that suggests that these are shell companies?
We start always with really the location of the entity and the activities conducted. So there are two things when we think about activities. One aspect is the activity on the license of the entity. But when we talk to a client, then we say, what do you actually do? Tell us, do you have any contracts with third parties? Do you advise your shareholders internally? Do you trade in goods? Do you provide services? So we really want to see what business they do.
Yeah.
And if they say, well, this year was really tough, we haven't done much. Then we say, oh, do you have any employees? They may say, oh, we have no employees. And then slowly but surely we look into the operational side. What do they have on the ground? Economic substance is always assessed by reference to what they would have in a given jurisdiction. So here, what do they really do? What links do they have with the UAE? Are those links sufficient for us to say that they have a substance? They have that entity for a reason. They need it for specific purposes, and then we're comfortable.
Yeah, okay, and considering you find out that these operations are shell operations, would the businesses face consequences? And what would they look like?
Well, they could. So a number of businesses who actually have already assessed they may not be able to prove they have sufficient substance, then really try to avoid filing applications to report on the economic substance criteria. If there is no filing in relation to economic substance for a longer period of time, the Ministry of Finance is very likely to notice that and then to start sending reminders to the company in question, and ultimately it will impose a fine on that business. There is another scenario, where the business makes the filing and answers a number of questions the ministry asked, and the ministry then verify the answers and say, wow, here it seems they actually don't have the economic substance.
Yeah.
So the consequences to that can be twofold. One of them is that the Ministry of Finance still can impose a fine.
Yeah.
So that's still available. But what is even more, I think, more important and more painful potentially to businesses is that the Ministry of Finance is allowed to share with other countries and other organizations the information about the business that has no sufficient economic substance in the UAE. So essentially that lack of economic substance exposes the owners of that business, the board of directors and the business itself to scrutiny in other countries, because usually the lack of economic substance in one country but still having some licenses for businesses means there is a potential tax question. There might be tax evasion behind it, right?
Yeah.
So it's other countries that are really interested to know about that economic substance.
Yeah. So you think, considering the ministry just like exploits all these secrets to other countries, this obviously impacts like the image of this company that was engaged in
Completely.
this.
So the reputational risk, the risk of potential sanctions being imposed in other countries. Now, we have seen that the ministry wants those businesses to comply.
Yeah.
They really first, encourage, they discuss, but under the current legislation, they have means of sharing the information with parties outside the UAE. Those parties would need to be specific parties. It would need to be tax authorities from another country. It could be the OECD, which is that international body that really looks after the economic substance principles around the world. So it's, of course, not sharing it with anyone, but there is that risk, and that risk is there to make sure that there is a huge deterrent for businesses not to comply, with economic substance.
Yeah. Okay. So there's really big consequences, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something else that I noticed you mentioned, it's about merger and acquisition transactions. So in terms of a merger, when two companies combine, an acquisition, when a larger company purchases the smaller company. And I noticed on your profile that you were involved in many of these. So in 2011, the First Reserve Corporation and Metallum Holdings, both of these being in different locations, so one in Connecticut and one in Luxembourg. So I wanted to ask you from this, how important you think stakeholding in international corporations is to the growth of both the target company and the acquirer company?
It could be hugely important. I think it could be hugely important because sometimes there are synergies that businesses have that they may make more efficient if they combine the efforts. So what do I mean by those synergies? There can be a business that has a manufacturing line, produces something, but always a producer would need some suppliers. Some of the businesses find themselves very reliant on one supplier. But also that supplier essentially needs to make sure that somebody buys those, components from them, right? For the production facility, for example. And every now and again, businesses that have those links and those synergies decide to go together to go through that merger type of transaction, or even to join, if not the entire business, maybe some divisions of their operation, because this way, as one business, they can make sure that they always have access to that component they need to, get from suppliers. But also for the supply side of things, it usually means that they have a guaranteed purchaser, right, of those components. So they could be very important. It always depends really on the type of the sector we're talking about who those two potential parties that talk to one another are. How commercially viable is that to them? Because of course they want to do it to see growth, to see bigger growth than the growth they can achieve individually.
Yeah, so you think by outsourcing this and getting a company that's like specified or like does a subset of what you already specialize in, that could be beneficial?
Could be, and it's a little bit of that, business side of focus, and not necessarily the legal hat that I'm now using, but having seen transactions over those 2 decades, I would see that companies, when they sit at the table, they usually already have a lot of things in common. Either they want to focus on the same market, and let's say one of them is very weak in India and the other one is strong in India, but the one that's weak in India would be very strong in the GCC. So each of them is actually bringing something to the table. Ultimately, it's supposed to be, it's a little bit like a corporate marriage, right?
Yeah.
Everybody brings something, but why do we have that? We want that, that relationship between the companies to be fruitful, to make sure that as one, they actually create even more job opportunities, that their growth strategy is much more attractive and successful.
Yeah, and obviously for the specifically like the acquisition side of the M&A, I wanted to ask for these like target companies, which are like usually the smaller companies, how would these acquisition companies that are obviously much bigger realize the growth potential in the undervalued target companies?
Yeah. So In your question, Tamara, I think there are two different angles that we can look at. So from the standpoint of the buyer, right? That big corporation, a lot of them have internal teams that look into venture capital investment into some startup entities, usually in their sector of operation or in the sector that they would like to tap into. And then really they contact those smaller operations and they offer to give them capital and to buy them out. But they would really usually, do it based on financial projections and how they see it.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of that small business, there is always, it's a tricky situation because there is, that big player coming. And on one hand, that big player usually offers cash, right? But on the other hand, they are aware of the fact there might be a growth potential. They don't want the business to be undervalued. They don't want to sell it too cheap, one could say. And what we then see is that there are periods of time when we see quite a slowdown in SMEs type of M&A where the target is actually like, a startup or quite a small or medium-sized entity, because valuations that are offered are too low. So usually there is some kind of a commercial reason. There are situations where you would have a startup that has a huge potential, and then a big conglomerate, Hewlett Packard will say, this is great, we would like to get this technology. There is John and his brother, they developed this great technology, something software related. And then let's imagine that actually those who own that small business immediately for something need cash. If a big conglomerate shows up and buys them out, even if that offer is not super attractive, they may actually be inclined to take it.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying when this large sum is posed by these large acquisition companies, I wanted to ask if startup companies are more inclined obviously to take this very undervalued price because they don't know their financial projections in the future.
Not necessarily. I think, Tamara, it's 50-50. So there are some that actually don't have the resources to think about those projections. They don't even have the bigger vision. And of course, then, the big guys will come in, they've done the projections. They have a team of people who would have done the research, who know. So there are those situations. And then sometimes there is that vulnerability of that startup who may unfortunately say too low. And then they realize that, even if they kept some shares, but the majority shareholder will be the big investor coming in, and then they're left with less than they could have really asked for. It happens sometimes, but there is also another basket of cases where we would see SMEs feel a lot of personal attachment to the business they've created. And sometimes they're asking for the price that is actually even out of reason. They want really a lot because they would have dedicated a portion of their life, an awful lot of their time towards developing something new. So that very strong personal attachment also means that a number of those SMEs are not going to sell too low. They feel very strongly about the business, and they can only do it if they really feel that the amount being offered is substantial.
And obviously in a minority of cases they're offered this substantial amount of money that they're willing to take. So so do you think this also contributes obviously to the failure of many of these target companies?
It does. It sometimes does, because they could actually reject an offer that is very good, although they subjectively feel that the business is valued a lot. I also think the business owners, in order to have that drive, they really have usually a big vision. They think this is an excellent software I'm developing. It's going to be a game changer for a lot of businesses. Sometimes it's not the case, but that type of thinking on one hand is great because it helps them boost the business and grow it. On the other hand, it might be a paralyzer, and they may actually miss some opportunities for investment where the price that was offered was clearly fair.
Yeah, so obviously bias, contributes to target companies just like misinterpreting the value of their business. But that's also where lawyers come in, and legal consultants, which is something else that I saw on your profile. So they advise legal matters and review the drafts. And I just wanted to ask how important these legal consultants are in terms of preliminary legal advices for startups.
They are, and I think startups should reach out to law firms, keeping in mind that a lot of law firms, including ours, might be happy to do some work pro bono. For example, we have special arrangements for SMEs. It's very important to have the guideline from the beginning. Even to be able to pick up the phone and have a 20-minute conversation. Oh, I want to hire an employee, how to do it. Oh, actually, I would like to enter into this contract. But my counterparty is saying that it has to be governed by German law. And then maybe we would say, oh no, how about you just, no, let's push back on this one. So some of the things that may seem pretty mundane, if things go well, they go well.
Yeah.
But I think contacting legal counsel is important. It's like a preventive measure. If things start going wrong, then if the documentation is pretty solid, there was that thought put into it, it's much easier to even, defend claims before the court, to file a case, to then take steps, or even if not involving the courts, if the framework is really solid, it's much easier to sit with the other party to the table and negotiate even difficult scenarios.
Yeah, okay. So obviously legal advisors are involved in the business-oriented setting, but also these advisors are responsible for, personal legal issues. So I wanted to ask what this meant, like on a personal note.
Oh, that's another part of of the corporate practice, and in fact we have that family business practice where I also sit. We advise family businesses, families. Oftentimes it would be patrons of families about their assets. About how they want to manage the assets when they start to age, or maybe they would like to actually leave part of the assets for the family members, for the son or daughter to manage, but also how to think about legacy and an inheritance. Because really the inheritance topic is not only about who is going to own the assets, but it's also about who will be the next CEO of my company, right? Mm-hmm. We also look into discussions between siblings. Sometimes they will come to us and say, you know what, the parents are really aging. They're holding on to the business, but our father is 88. And we really would like to be able to help him. Mm-hmm. What can we do? So with family business, it's a very interesting part of law, because the skill set required is usually related to corporate law.
Yeah.
These will be issues related to companies, to some transactions, assets ownership, and structuring how to own those assets and inheritance. But also there is a very vivid human element. There is always going to be somebody who worked for the wealth, probably with some other family members. Oftentimes I see that there is a husband who says, I want everything with my wife. I wouldn't be where I am without my wife, for example. So we take those things into account.
Yeah.
And sometimes we laugh with my colleagues that we are in discussions with individual family members, and we feel a little bit like we're doing psychological counseling a little bit more than the legal advice. But that's actually the beauty of that advisory to families. It's a very interesting area, hugely growing. And really very good that families look into that, because building wealth is great, and now seeing it continue. What happens when I'm no longer around? Can I have somebody from within my relatives to help then manage it, run it, so that it doesn't get destroyed, right?
Yeah. So in terms of these like family-run businesses, it's obviously a very intricate or like a very sensitive topic. So I wanted to ask, do you think maybe these conflicts of interests or maybe disputes that happen between family members, this psychological aspect then further causes damages on the business, financially speaking, or in terms of its growth?
Hugely, and I think this is a very important point that you're raising, Tamara. What we see still is that family patrons, even though they might be really supported and surrounded by competent, loving, and really driven family members, a lot of them don't want to let go of any type of authority in relation to a business. So the chairman at the age of 82 wants to approve every check for every amount issued by a conglomerate of 40 companies that he owns. Of course, he cannot physically do that, and that starts paralyzing the business. So unless he puts some powers, and delegates them to a son or a daughter, or even the third-party CEOs or head of finance, then that can damage that. And family disputes as well. What those disputes do very often is they put the business into a stagnant position. They paralyze decisions. Let's imagine we have two brothers and a sister on the board of directors, and to even approve financial statements, we need to have a board resolution. The two brothers don't talk to one another. The sister decided she's not going to get involved at all because she doesn't want to upset either of the brothers, and we are not able to get the resolution approved to approve the financial statement for the preceding financial year. That means there is a block. Potentially there can be sanctions with authorities because we won't be able to file the financials on time, right? Those things then can have a little bit of a domino effect. Yeah. So clearly negative impact, unfortunately, on the business itself.
Yeah, so the majority of family businesses do face these issues.
They do, and some of them face it at a very small scale. Small scale, and they're able to actually handle things together and ultimately to find ways of understanding. But the businesses that are huge with multiple family members, one of the families that I advised some time ago comprised of 69 immediate family members. And then naturally, because we had so many people, it was across 3 generations. So the grandfather of the family patron, his children, and the grandchildren. 69 altogether, plus for some of the children, spouses of the children, right? So husbands and wives who come from different families altogether. And that created, so the bigger the family, I think, the bigger risk of more of those family misunderstandings to arise, because again, conflicts then, of course, naturally more people, the risk increases of potential conflicts.
Yeah, and do you think these abundant families are more prevalent in the GCC countries? Because obviously here in the Middle East, they're more prone to, have a large family tree.
Yes, they unfortunately they are. We also see another element that I think is natural. That's something that we would also see in other parts of the world. But the first generation builds that wealth, works very hard. Even brothers work together. They're happy to be together. They pass away. There might be a conflict between the second generation about the division of wealth, but somehow the second generation ultimately will manage to handle. The third generation, situations start going really off. And I would sometimes even, try to understand the psychology behind it. And I think since the third generation no longer remembers the building of the business, the effort, the joint effort to create it into what it is, and also since it's a number of different individuals who might have done a variety of things throughout the world. The interest is not then. So if there is less engagement, then on one hand it may mean, okay, I don't care, so I'm not going to take any decisions. Or for some, it might be, well, I no longer remember what the vision of my grandfather was, but I want to push my vision, my new vision. So the third generation is usually where things start becoming very difficult, and there are very few family businesses around the world that survive through the third generation.
Yeah, so you think as the increase of generations occur, the original mantra of the company is sort of lost in the process of like the multiplication of offsprings, and eventually it just turns into something that's simply for financial revenue or personal interest rather than what the original intention of the company was.
Completely.
Okay, and finally speaking, you mentioned also how you had experience with these IPO deals, about how there's the selling of shares to the public for the first time in order to raise money, and you did this in terms of the Bombay Stock Exchange. So I just wanted to ask how this occurrence benefited the GCC countries, because you mentioned how it also caused these implications for countries in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, IPOs of companies that actually have an asset pool in the GCC is very good for profile building. So prospectuses are in public domain. There is a lot of publicity that companies do through social media, through newspapers, through really radio channels to talk about the IPO. And if there is a discussion about the IPO even on the Bombay Stock Exchange, but there is a huge pool of assets, which is the case with Kalyan jewelry, here then those who reach or listen to the news essentially are reminded that there is this huge potential in the GCC and the wider MENA region.
Yeah, so you think the news is sort of skewed towards these GCC countries, would just increase, the benefits that they reap from transactions?
Completely. I mean, through the different news channels and media, those who are in charge of investment decisions, for example, a lot depends on their exposure. If they hear about the UAE a lot, then the next time they're thinking about the market to consider, they will think, the UAE. But if they think really, if they hear a lot about another part of the world, then naturally it will be in their mind. So those IPOs are really important, especially if they happen abroad. But there is that GCC element, because then, of course, there is that discussion about assets in the region. So what do you do in the GCC? What do you sell? How is the market? How are things doing? Also under the IPO prospectus, there will always be a huge set of financial statements, and then those who want to dig into that more, and those who will be in charge of investment decisions for their own companies and their growth strategy, for example, most likely will look into the financials and then see how the revenue is playing out from the GCC countries.
So do you think this increase in news coverage, especially recently, has caused an increased involvement of these GCC countries in these different IPO transactions?
I think in general it's been a good boost. There is a lot of foreign direct investment coming because there is an interest. So it's a good thing for IPOs, but more than that, it's a very good thing for foreign direct investment coming in, for the economy to actually get cash injections that every economy needs.
Mm-hmm. And referring to this specific example about the Kalyan jewelers and the Bombay Stock Exchange, I wanted to ask, since the company is now publicly listed, if you've observed any major economic shifts and whether this IPO listing is beneficial, generally speaking.
Well, the client does consider it very beneficial. I think the fact that there is an IPO means first of all the company has a very good governance model. It's transparent. It means that it's much easier for it to secure lending at very good rates. It also means that really there is more trust that business partners have in listed companies, Callion being one example. A small thing that all the banks, law firms and other professional service providers, for example, we do KYC checks on our potential clients. And if a potential client has a listed company somewhere under the structure, then we say, oh, we don't do KYC.
Yeah.
We can have everything, on the platform of that stock exchange. We'll find it. This is fine. And then that approach by others, by business partners, for example, or financial institutions, means that then companies, and Callion being one of them, can really benefit through those different channels of actually, from the IPO.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the capital injection from the IPO, where for the specific investment, they were able to get capital from investors through the public offering. But long term, throughout the lifetime of that company after listing, they continue to see benefits through their relationships with other parties.
Yeah, and do you think like a large part of these benefits is the transparency of the company and whether this makes it more appealing to the public?
Completely. Transparency is a big thing. Everybody has access then to financial statements. On the company, there are really stringent disclosure environments. It seems like companies that are listed are a much more trusted partner for anybody else doing business. So transparency and that governance model is a very big thing.
Yeah. So you think, generally speaking, with all of that, do you think companies that are considering, listing their company or corporation on the public market for purchase, do you think that's a good idea and that people should, increase the rate at which they do that? Or is it more often than not non-beneficial?
Yeah, well, I think it's a balancing act. Some companies essentially may not, first of all, some companies may not be willing to have full disclosure of information.
Yeah.
If I think about potentially even family businesses, a number of family businesses would say, well, an IPO is great because there will be capital coming in, but then everybody will know I'm a chairman, then everybody will know what the remuneration of the head of finance is, because the disclosure obligations on public companies are really, there's a huge list, they're pretty extensive. So there might be businesses that wouldn't benefit from that. In fact, it's not part of their vision. They would like to stay, one would even say, low profile.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it has nothing to do about hiding information. It's much more about keeping it private and keeping my business and my information, let's keep it within ourselves, right?
Yeah.
But for a number of businesses, an IPO could be a very good exercise to go through, so long as the management of the business is prepared to be transparent, wants to adapt to a more stringent, more demanding governance model. So for example, having a larger board of directors with independent directors, having an audit committee, remuneration committee. So that framework also, of course, it increases operational costs because there's got to be, the hiring of those expert individuals. But also it means that that the business functions in a much more proper way if the business has an appetite for it and thinks it could be attractive to investors. I think listings and public offerings are really very, very beneficial. They're also beneficial, I think, on the social level for the society. It's not only about the company itself, it's also about us as a public being able to participate in a venture. There is a business that we think we like. We hear there will be an IPO. We can contact a broker and say, you know what, I want to buy shares. It's our way of participating in something that we think looks interesting. So there is also that element to it.
Yeah, and do you think these IPOs, as you said, because of non-disclosure, this belief amongst like family corporations specifically, and do you think that because of this and also because they want to keep the mantra of the business alive, and obviously the IPO listing and this government involvement would sort of cause an increase in the board members, so do you think because of all these factors family businesses are less inclined to participate in IPO?
They are less inclined, and there is also another component that is not so visible in the region, but in general, that disclosure very often would mean much more visibility to authorities, much more visibility to potential tax authorities, and there is also that element that really wealth, a number of families, high net worth or ultra high net worth families, really would like to keep things to themselves because they are worried that somebody can use things against them, and even if they follow the law, essentially it might be just that human jealousy element, right?
Yeah.
Where things start being more available to the public. So family businesses would rarely be interested in IPOs. It will usually be typical corporates, typical commercially driven businesses that are saying, yes, we want to go to another level. We really need that corporate governance. We want full transparency. We want to grow that way. And then there is a buy-in.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciated all the information. I think everyone watching also appreciated it.
A pleasure, Tamara.
Yeah,
Goodbye.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.